Office of Public School Construction stakeholder meeting for the Career Technical Education Facilities Program tiebreaker method. So I wanted to thank everybody for being here. We have a few people here. I believe we have some people on the phone. Additionally, if you're watching on the webcast, you'll be able to call in if you have any questions or comments you want to share with us. And that number is on our website, but if you don't want to go there, well, you probably already are there if you're on the webcast, but the number is 888-363-4734, and then the code to participate is 207294. So once again, 888-363-4734, and then the participation code is 207294. Our agenda is also on the website if you don't have a copy of that. And we have, so just to introduce who we are, I'm Brian Lepask. I'm the Operations and Policy Manager and Program Services at OPSC. This is Tracy Sharp. She's the supervisor for our appeals unit and also for the Career Tech program. The reason we're here today is we noticed that in the last funding cycle we had, there was about 41 applications that had tied scores, and then additionally we had some applications that had tied weighted scores. And so fortunately for us, it didn't impact our ability to fund projects or it didn't cut anybody out of line or anything like that this year. But we wanted to address it before that happens so that if we do have some ties that take place in subsequent cycles, we're able to order those properly and fund people without having to have some big controversy. So we have our proposal in our agenda. This is really just some ideas to get us started today. We're looking for feedback on those, and then if anybody has any other ideas, we want to take those into and kind of discuss those and see what might be the most appropriate way to go forward. We're tentatively planning another meeting on August the 2nd, and the notice for that will go out shortly, and we'll publish an item about a week or so before that we have that meeting. But the idea is to kind of come up with ideas today and then kind of finalize them at the next meeting. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Tracy. She's going to get into the more technical aspects of the program, and we'll get this going. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Brian. And thank you again for everyone who's joined us here and via webcast and on the teleconference. So as Brian said, we're looking for input on creating additional criteria for tiebreakers in the scoring, or not in the scoring process, in the funding order process. So as many of you know, we just completed the cycle 4 of the Career Technical Education program. It was originally started by Prop 1D and then got $500 million additional through Prop 51. And the board had designated $125 million for cycle 4, and then we have cycle 5 coming up, where districts will be submitting applications, the first step applications to the Department of Education come this October. And I am blanking on that specific due date right at the moment, but it is in October this year. So in advance of that, as Brian said, we want to start this discussion about the funding order. As you know, when districts submit an application to the Department of Education, they are getting a score for that. We use those scores to then decide the funding order of applications when they come to us with a funding application. The funding order is determined by two things: the score a district gets on their CTE plan from the Department of Education, and second element is the locale of the project, and that being urban, suburban, or rural. So the current regulations, SOP regulations, state that the funding order will be, we will fund one suburban, one urban, one rural. It's the highest ranking, highest scoring project in each locale, and then go on to the next three. The order within those three is done by the highest score. So if the urban application has, for example, a score of 140, the suburban has 139, the rural has 138, that'll be the order, and so on. What I found as I was working and my team was working through creating the order for cycle 4 is that there were times when I had two urbans with the same score, 139, or I had an urban and a suburban that had the same score, 139. I didn't have a case where all three had 139. But that's the instances that we're running into. And as Brian mentioned, we didn't run into a situation where at that designated amount of 125 million, when we got down to that number of 125, we didn't have a tiebreaker right there at that line to decide which application was going to get funding or not. But within the complete list, we want to have consistency in how applications are ordered. So what we did, for starters, absent something in regulation, is just for purposes of creating our current, or the list that was presented to the board in May, was to say, okay, what day was the 5010, that's the CTE funding application, received, and put that one first in the order. And then if there was still a tie, and let me back up, we went for the overall score to the weighted score. If the weighted score was still tied, then we took to the second method of what day was your application received by OPSC. And then if there was still a tie, and there still was a tie, and some were received on the same day, we went to just an alphabetical listing on the funding order matrix for cycle 4. As I said, this didn't affect anybody's funding. It wasn't a decision maker. It was just for placement on the list. So today, in our write-up, we provided some background on the scoring that is contained, the scoring elements that are all part of coming from statute that CDE uses, just for some background reference. And then also, to moving forward, we have some basic ideas of what we came up with input from the Department of Education for what could be included in SFP regulation for the future. We started with, and these are in no particular order. This is not a ranking 1 through 8 of our opinion. They're just simply ideas. We started with the possibility of the date the Form 5010 was received by OPSC. That is a very small window. So if a district, say this year, for example, got their score on January 31st and applications were due to OPSC February 21st, that's a pretty tight window. And the odds of applications being received on the same day is very high. So,
Especially the last day.
yes, especially the last day. And we introduced a new element into our program this year in that we allowed for electronic submittals. So, and we used that electronic submittal date as long as it was a complete application for determining this. The second potential criteria would be the date the grant application was received by CDE. So on that first step in the process, basically CDE is starting to accept applications. As far as I know, like you could submit one today if you were ready, because their application is out there and published. And then you have up until the last day. So that's a little bigger time frame from when an application is able to be submitted to the Department of Education. Another element could be which one is a first-time recipient of CTE funding from the program. We are not using, well, the fourth one is an application in a service region that has the fewest applications funded in the cycle. We're not using service regions as part of our funding order matrix right now. It was used in the past per regulation, where we used the county superintendent's service regions of the state to break up the state into the 11 service regions and allotted funding to each one of those based on high school enrollment. So there was a ratio based on enrollment for each. That's not used currently, as I said, but it could be a consideration for a tiebreaker. Number 5, another idea, an application for an underrepresented industry sector. That would require a little more discussion to determine a definition for what would define an underrepresented industry sector. We could use something like number 6, a school site with a higher percentage of high need students, free and reduced lunch, for example, foster students. And we'd probably need to reach out to potentially the Department of Education for a little background on how to get those numbers if that was something to be considered. Another one is an application funding industry sectors that address high labor market needs. Another item that would require a little more fleshing out to figure out how we would determine what a which market would be would have a higher need than another. And then we have kind of an open-ended, what other ideas do you have to provide to us? So with that, I'd like to open it up to your comments on these items or any other ones, what you might like to share. And for those who are present in the room, if you would utilize, what I'll start with actually to make this a little simpler is I'll start with the group in the room, and if anybody here has any comments, I'll have you use the microphones that are available. And then second, we'll open it up to those who may be participating on the teleconference to give input. And if you would, when you make your comments, state your name and who you represent when you're giving your comments, that would be helpful. Anything to add to that, Brian?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, let's get started then. Have a first volunteer here in the room who would like to. Thank you.
James Scott from Pittsburgh Unified School District. I like the idea of having, if we have a tie, to go to the lowest enrollment of that sector. That way, if you have a district, if it's a rural area, and the rural area has a top of 5,000 to 6,088, that lowers one because you're trying to get the max. And the lower area.
Okay, so are you talking about the enrollment at the site or in the district? Or maybe both?
At the site.
At the site, okay. So you're suggesting to give priority to the school site as compared with the other ones that's tied with the lowest enrollment?
Yeah. Yes, that
Okay.
is correct.
Okay, just to be clear, thanks. Anybody else in the room?
Good morning. I'm Jeremy Kogan. I'm the Director of Facilities Planning at Santa Ana Unified School District. I'm really glad my schedule allowed me to be here today. Santa Ana probably comes from a different perspective. As the last gentleman, we're one of the 10 largest districts in the state of California. So we did participate in the fourth funding round. The topic of tie breaking is relevant to us. I believe in the last funding round, even though we submitted 5 applications, one had a passing score. We weren't awarded funding, but we were still tied with several districts. I think there were 3 other districts we had an exact tie score with. I believe one or more of those was in the same locale, so we recognize that this could be coming up again in the future. We've gone over and kind of looked at the 8 topics, categories that were mentioned, and I'll just kind of really briefly give our feedback on each of those. The first one on the date that the 50-10 was received, we really don't see any issue with that, other than, of course, that OPSC staff and that the online system are ready to get those as soon as possible, because as districts really rush out there to put it in, as long as you're ready and your systems are ready, that's no problem. The second one on the date that the grant application was received by CDE, as you mentioned, Tracy, with a due date already out there for the next round, that would really encourage districts to get their applications in as soon as possible. We would caution against that. It could lead to less thoughtful applications and responses as districts hurry to get in to potentially have a better outcome in the case of a tie. We'd really like to see the full application time period sort of uncompetitive until that actual due date. And we'd really like to see districts spend as much time as possible working with their teams to build very strong projects. The third one on first-time recipients of CTEFP funding, we'd suggest perhaps an alternative for that one, something like a district that was not a recipient of CTEFP funding in the immediate prior funding round, as opposed to just a blanket statement. So that really looks at, in the last round, in the fourth round, did the district receive any funding? If they did, or if they didn't, that would make the difference in the tiebreaker. The fourth one, an application in a service region that have the fewest applications funded in the cycle. Santa Ana Unified would have no objection to that criterion. The fifth one, likewise, application for underrepresented industry sector. We'd have no objection to that. It did kind of get us thinking about programs that have a stronger industry sector need in that region. So if your program is in a particular industry sector and in that region, there's a higher need relative to that program than in the, say, a tiebreaker scenario where the other region doesn't have as much of a nexus, you might award the tie to the region where there's really a stronger linkage. The sixth one, a school site with a higher percentage of high-need students. We'd have no objection to that criteria. The seventh one, an application funding industry sectors that address higher labor market needs. I think that kind of goes along with the same comment I made for number 5. And definitely some questions about how we determine what becomes the higher labor market needs. And then the eighth one about additional suggestions. One for us was looking at the programs and just how many pupils, how many kids that program serves. If you're a tie situation between two districts, really regardless of locale, it'd be nice to know which program is going to end up serving the most number of kids in those facilities. You might have same industry sector, you might have one in a rural, one in an urban, but maybe the rural one's going to serve twice as many kids flowing through those facilities, and that'd be nice, vice versa. We'd also really like, given that this conversation came up today, we'd really like to encourage a future conversation, a future set of stakeholder discussions about the model in general for determining funding order. I think in particular for us, the current regulation that separates the plan scores by locale, we see it as being really an unequal distribution because it, to us, overrepresents the rural, underrepresents the urban, and I'm sure there may be others who disagree with that. But you know, from our standpoint and the students we serve, we'd like to have a future discussion on that. So I'll just finish off by one final suggestion, which is when we're looking at the possible tiebreakers, instead of ranking the tiebreakers, so saying, okay, the first category we're going to look at for tiebreakers this, the second is this, and so on. What if OPSC staff were to develop a list of, say, 4 or 5 criteria of tiebreakers, and that look at the two cases, District A and District B, that are tied, and the district between the two where they outperform their peer in the most tiebreakers would break the tie, as opposed to picking one criteria and then going down.
So you're really talking about like another score, like a third score, combining a few, like 3 or 4 factors.
Right, as opposed
Okay,
to saying
so that would only be
A,
one
B, C.
tiebreaker then.
It would be, but you would run each tiebreaker case and say, okay, tiebreaker A, tiebreaker B, tiebreaker C, tiebreaker D, did of the two districts,
Yeah.
which district broke the ties the most number of times? That district is wins the tiebreaker
Okay.
in that case. So just a few of our thoughts. Thank you for holding the meeting and for inviting us to comment. We would definitely like to help eliminate ties in the future.
Hi, Todd Butcher from Fullerton Joint Union High School District. In thinking about this process with tiebreakers, instead of making it even more complicated, in my opinion, one of the things that I would look at is that if a district already received a grant from the previous funding cycle, that the one that had not received one would get it, as well as then if you had 2 districts that both received a funding cycle, even in California Public Contract Code, if you have a bid received that has the same number, it's the governing body's ability at that point in time to flip a coin, do a card toss, do whatever you want. And I know it sounds funny, but that's exactly how we do it. You know, if we receive the same bid. So
We do bingo balls for
yeah.
our charter program.
Yeah,
So
and it's the same thing. So instead of going into a whole nother criteria and making it even harder on the OPSC staff, I'm sorry if it comes down to a flip of a coin, but sometimes it does.
okay. So random event.
And Todd, I think you also mentioned, you were kind of alluding to the sort of number 3, but with a little bit of a twist on it. If they had received funding already, but we could take that another step.
So yeah, so what I'm saying is that if 2 districts turned in and they had the same score.
Mm-hmm.
If one district had already received a grant from a previous funding cycle,
Mm-hmm.
and the District B hadn't, then
Mhm.
District B would automatically get it,
Okay.
is my theory.
Okay.
But if both of them had, so then you have that tie, then it comes
Right.
down to a
Then
coin
the
toss
random.
or whatever. yeah.
Okay. So, okay. And were you, can I clarify, because I want to touch on a little bit of what Jeremy shared as well. He had mentioned in the most recent funding cycle. Do you have a preference in any funding cycle, or are you, or does it, do you have a preference there?
Not necessarily, but I think it should
Okay.
be from the most recent funding cycle.
Most recent,
You know,
okay.
I mean, I think that, you know, I mean, some of us had funding cycles. So actually, when I was working in Santa Ana many years ago, I mean, you know, we had funding cycles back,
Right.
you know, 7, 8 years ago. So,
Mhm. But it's been a number of years.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
Good morning. My name's Kelly Long. I'm with Hancock Park and DeLong, and I'm choking, so pardon me. Hancock Park and DeLong. We actually represent a number of school districts in the CTEFP program. Just a couple thoughts I think that would reiterate a lot of what you've already heard. As far as using the date received by OPSC or CDE, I would caution against that. I think the idea of having a deadline for the date is adequate, and as long as you meet that requirement, you should be fine. You know, there would be some instances where, you know, a district maybe had a high-scoring application but didn't get funded. They could literally turn around and turn it in the next day, versus someone else who's coming in the first time. You know, it's going to be a later sort of a situation. So, and if you have that deadline, use it as a deadline.
Just to be clear,
Yep.
sorry, the concern would be that the app wouldn't be as good as it could potentially be if they had to rush it in. That's kind of
If you're trying to rush it, yeah, and I think you know, the idea is that you are meeting the requirement of the deadline, and don't try and, you know, add an extra, you know, bonus for getting it in faster. If they're, you know, otherwise, you know, why have the deadline at that point? You know. As far as your third option, the first-time recipients, I kind of like the suggestion also to go with, if there were a tie score and one applicant had received funding either in that round or perhaps prior round, and the other tie had not received any funding, go with the district that has not received funding. I think that definitely goes towards the intent of the program to get as wide a net of programs around the state. I mean, there was one particular district this past cycle that, you know, through no fault of their own and to their benefit, you know, I think had 8 or 10 applications approved. And if they were tied with somebody, you know, I think it would make sense to be able to, you know, pretty easily go to the other person just to, you know, expand that funding around the state. Also, some of the options as far as application funding, industry sectors that address higher market needs, again, pretty tricky justification to get there. I'm not sure how you would do that. So I would kind of caution against that one, perhaps. And then I think actually that same one, the labor market needs, is essentially also being considered in the earlier weighted score by CDE. That's one of the components in there. So you're just reusing that same thing. If you've already used it, I don't know if you would, you know, then just pull it out of there. So, yeah. I do like the suggestion of perhaps, you know, if there is still that tie, number of pupils being served, that sort of thing. I don't have a clear silver bullet suggestion or anything, but just wanted to get a couple observations out there.
Thank you.
I will note, because Kelly, you brought up a good point there of kind of looking back at where we already have factors that are considered that are required by statute to be considered, that in the application scoring, and I'm looking at our agenda, page 2, if you happen to be looking at it, part of the scoring already done by CDE, number 2, is pupil enrollment projections on the overall score. And in the weighted scores, we are already looking, number 2, total annual number of students expected to attend the program. So don't want to speak against anybody's idea, just making a note to carry on what you were mentioning, Kelly, that that is a factor that is already part of the score as well. So we'll definitely look at those things. And I think we've covered everyone here. Unless there's additional comments from somebody in the room, we can go over to the teleconference and see if there is anyone who would like to chime in. Well, I hope our teleconference is working, because at this point hearing nothing. We appreciate your comments. So what will be, I think, probably an okay time to move on now that we've heard from everybody in the room. I haven't heard from anybody out in the audience yet. We'd like to keep open any written comments that anyone would like to put forward until close of business, Monday the 23rd. We are intending to hold another meeting, another public meeting, to kind of summarize what we heard today and anything additional that we might get in writing approximately 2 weeks, what did we say? 2 or 3 weeks from now, before the next board, enough time to share our comments, put out another written report of what was stated, and to make sure that we captured everybody's ideas and properly. So with that, like I say, we'd like to keep it open until Monday, July 23rd, close of business, which would be 5 o'clock preferably, to submit written comments. This could be via email or via letter, and I would suggest sending your written comments to Brian LePasque or Tracy Sharp. Our contact information is on our website, and we'll go ahead and consider those as well and include them in the future agenda item. And yeah, go from there. Anything else from the group here or on the phone? Okay.
It was an entertaining webcast.
Well, the first time we tried it, the thing broke. The handle broke.
Yeah. Proof that
Not
no
ideal.
system is perfect. All right. Well, thank you for everyone for coming. We are going to go ahead and close this. And as I said, written comments are welcome.
Thank you.